Hello and welcome. What ails Indian infrastructure or infrastructure in India and the problems that we've been witnessing in the last few years and the deficit that's clearly mounting? Let's put that question to Naseer Munjee, the man who founded IDFC, the organization created to solve some of these problems, at least on a funding end, and now also chairman of DCB Bank. Mr. Munjee, thank you very much for speaking with us. So you're one of the original architects of the approach to solving infrastructure problems with structured funding and creating the post-liberalization framework for fixing the infrastructure bottleneck. Now, many years have passed, or some years have passed, and we're all staring at this abyss that is the lack of infrastructure. So where do we begin and what can we fix?
Yeah, I think let me start by saying that when we started IDFC, 99% of infrastructure was in public domain.
Right.
It was all publicly managed, publicly executed, publicly invested in, whether it's telecom, railways, you name it. And our task was, how do we get it out of the public domain? How do we bring private sector participation? And in a sense, IDFC did exactly that. And we were the first promoters of the whole concept of PPP,
right.
public-private partnerships. And I think in those early days, we actually set the scene for port privatization, for civil aviation reform, for power distribution, power generation, telecom on our revenue share model. So all of that early work was done by us. And I think it's held India in good stead because it's those initiatives that are still bearing fruit.
Right.
It's given us the new airports that we have. It's given us the ports that we have today. It's given us private power distribution companies. So in a sense, it was quite pioneering. But in a sense, in India, infrastructure can be dropped in three boxes. One is you sell the asset, you privatize. Now that's a hard one in India. People don't want to sell the family silver. So we couldn't really make much dent in privatization. The second box is commercialization, where you sweat the asset. Right? You don't actually sell the asset, but you get the government to hand over the assets to be better managed. And this is the BOTs and the BOTs and all of that. This is where we were, I think, most successful in pushing the agenda. And the last box is output-based contracts, which became known as the annuity financing model, which is again very controversial when I pushed it, but now it's now regarded as a normal. What we've seen is huge progress in infrastructure in those 6-7 years because we moved into a very different domain and we got the private sector involved. Now, after so many years, when I look back and I say, what has gone wrong? I think there are 2 or 3 things I'd like to mention. The first is monetary policy in India, 2010 onwards, has gone in exactly the opposite direction from what I wish it had. So today we have very high interest rates. We have very tight.
So you're speaking as a borrower, I mean, not as a
no,
lender.
yeah. So when you have to finance infrastructure and you want the private sector in, you're going to have financial arrangements which make sense. Today they don't make any sense, and you need IRRs of 22-25% in infrastructure. Triple B companies can't borrow for less than 15% and 14%. It's not going to happen. So that again is the biggest constraint on infrastructure. Second is a lot of the private sector infrastructure companies that began operations, GMRs, the GMK, GVKs, the Lancos, all of them, over-leveraged. They were so excited by it, they just grew dramatically and were over-leveraged. They did not anticipate the monetary environment that we are facing, high liquidity problems and very high interest rates. So as a result of which, they've gone into trouble. So they need to deleverage. So a lot of infrastructure assets are for sale today.
So people have walked out.
Or people have walked out, or just walked away from projects. So that's a major issue. The third thing that I'd like to say is that, the public-private partnership model that we promoted, and I look back, there are 2 problems. First is, for PPPs to actually work, it needs very strong public institutions. We don't have those public institutions because you need somebody to hold up the government side of things, and that does not exist. We have the institutions, but they're not properly structured. You could say HUDCO is a good public institution for housing and urban, and IIFSL is a very good public institution for infrastructure. But they haven't actually played the role that they should have. So there's an institutional problem.
Is that also as in they haven't sort of managed to give it that gravitas?
Yes, to give it the sort of framework to protect public sector interest, but at the same time discipline the private sector and bring it in. So this is the first problem, that we need to strengthen the public institutions that operate in infrastructure. The second problem is the last P in PPP never happened. So we never saw partnerships. We just saw public-private contracting. And where that contracting was with the public sector, you had very one-sided agreements. For example, GAIL India would have gas agreements which said, we'll give you the gas if you have it, and if you don't, tough. You know, you can't run things like that. So I think, and you're seeing the pricing models, etc., and power all coming to the fore now. So as a result of which, not only the private sector operators are restructuring now, they're in deep trouble, but also we need to restructure the sorts of agreements we signed at that time. For example, fixed prices on power. And suddenly the energy costs just went through the roof, and everybody's caught in the middle.
For which the government doesn't seem to be in a mood.
Exactly, in a mood to change. So everything is stuck. It's become a logjam. The other area is institutional reform itself. You know, for example, in the old days, the economy was a Soviet economy, Sovietly centrally planned economy. And in the old days, the commanding heights of the economy was supposed to be controlled by government. Hence, we created ministries for every activity. So today you have 12 ministries that impinge on infrastructure. Everything is separate. Civil aviation is separate, shipping is separate, railways is separate, power is separate, telecom is separate, ports are separate. You cannot have integrated infrastructure development with 12 different ministries. The structure is wrong. I've been arguing very, very vociferously, to no avail, of course, that we need an infrastructure commission, a permanent infrastructure commission. And we need to get rid of some of these ministries. And you need to combine this. You could have one energy ministry and one telecommunications ministry and one transport ministry. Bring it down to 3. And then have all those 3 come under the infrastructure commission, which would then drive an integrated approach to infrastructure. What we need is sequencing and integration. And these 2 words don't even appear in the infrastructure agenda. So for example, you would build a port because the drafts are good, but nobody looks at connectivity. It's very crazy to say that our ports were built and the connectivity didn't come for 5 years or 6 years, which means rail and road. You cannot have a port where the evacuation doesn't exist through railways and roads. Only now we are seeing some progress on that. So we need to integrate. 70% of our container traffic on ports is actually transshipped out of Sri Lanka.
Right.
And that's been the case over the last 10 years. We have not made a dent on that. So we've got to now pull up our socks, actually look at the structural constraints that exist, the financial constraints that exist, as well as the institutional constraints that exist. Right. in infrastructure.
And how are things on the demand side? I mean, you know, so a lot of this was looking particularly acute because we were growing furiously and so on, which we are not right now.
Yeah. No, on the demand side too, the any economy to grow is going to require infrastructure. In fact, the government's role today in a modern economy is only infrastructure. Governance, that's governing frameworks into which markets actually function. This idea that you don't need regulation and just free markets will solve the problem has been proved to be absolutely erroneous. You need regulation, you need government intervention, but you don't need them to operate things. You know, they need to set frameworks. Even the regulatory structure that India has set up, I think, is thoroughly erroneous. In a sense, we're very influenced by Sovietism. You know, we have these 9-12 ministries, we have why do you need a central regulator? Every state has a regulator. Regulators are staffed by bureaucrats. Why can't you have independent? And regulation is a very complex business. You need economists, you need projections, you need a lot of data, you need a lot of data analytics. And this is not easy work. So in a sense, if I were in position of power, I would say, right, have one energy regulator, have one transport regulator, have one telecommunications regulator.
Right. So if I were to sort of come to the present, there are a lot of projects, for instance, in roads and ports, which are going a-begging. I mean, they've been put up for bids, but no one's turning up. And it's almost, it's an immediate problem and cannot be resolved by the creation of a commission or a regulatory commission to manage regulations or oversee private-public partnerships and so on. Or those will take time. What's the solution for the next 6 months to a year, without which we are going to...
I'm afraid there's no quick fix. So today, everything is working against infrastructure, as I mentioned. The structures are working against it. Sectoral policy is working against it. If you look at each sector, civil aviation, we are almost, so we have regulation which will kill civil aviation with our ATC, with our with costs of the costs of running an airline just dramatically going up. Through airport charges went up 140–150% overnight. Now, how can these costs be absorbed, and why should this could be sequenced in some way? So you have telecom. We've seen the mess we have in telecom policy, power policy, energy policy. So we are seeing problems in each of these areas. So not only is the macroeconomy negative, sectoral policy is negative, right? And the more ministries you have and more attitudes in terms of how those sectoral policies are going to be set, you create problems. Now, when you look at the private sector, they are not going to. Today, the world is a different place. There are problems right across the world. Private companies are de-risking. They will not take on risks that are unmanageable. And I think India has come to a point where those risks are unmanageable or unknown. So when they're unmanageable and unknown and nobody's in charge, I mean, who do you appeal to? And they've seen 2G. You've seen the coal linkages problem. You've seen the energy thing. You've seen the regulators and how they operate. Look at the IRDA, for example, in insurance. I mean, it's enough to say everybody, yes, all right, we can throw a loose change.
What about the IRDA in insurance?
Well, I don't want to go into those details. I used to be on an insurance company board. But, getting products approved through IRDA, getting things done through IRDA was a challenge. So, I think regulation is about protecting customers and protecting the way markets function. It is not about day-to-day management of the industry. It's not a Soviet-type planning system where you get into the micro management of enterprises. Unfortunately, we haven't learned that lesson. We need a mindset change away from central planning and this central control.
And in some ways, you're saying that this still prevails.
Yes. Oh, yes. Very much so.
In all its...
I've always maintained the Soviet state is alive and well in India. It's always been. And my metaphor for this is rubber stamps.
Okay.
If the airport, when you start and when you leave, you'll have 10 rubber stamps on your boarding pass. This has to go. This is a metaphor of these checks and balances that are put into the system. In a very inappropriate way, and no country does this anymore. Right. And you ask yourself, why are we doing it? So we've got to simplify. One, we've got to make clear, transparent regulation. We have to have an outcome-based policy, that we want certain outcomes, and we want to see those outcomes. And things that are getting in the way of those outcomes have to be thoroughly discussed and constraints eliminated. We're not looking at it in that way.
Last question, as we run out of time. What's the bright side, if any?
Well, the bright side is that there's a huge potential for investment and for improvement. There's a huge potential. We're talking about $1 trillion in network infrastructure, but we need another $1 trillion of investment in our cities and our urban infrastructure. Huge potential and all of this is for growth, because the more infrastructure investment happens, it itself generates a demand in the economy, and it starts, it generates the sort of demand pull growth that we need. it's waiting for it to happen. And I'm saying that, you know, all it needs is somebody to sit down and say, look, let's do it. Let's get rid of these constraints. These constraints are man-made, and they can be actually done in a matter of months. I don't see why it should take years to change the way things function. So India has a phenomenal opportunity. I would think that if we had, you know, sort of had the right policies in place today we would be growing at 8% instead of the 4% that we are. It's entirely policy constrained.
Right, and we'll hopefully come back to that in good time. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks very much.